Welcome to the case of the Whispering Walls, a Sherlock Holmes adventure from the series The Feminine Mystique. Sherlock Holmes and the Women of Baker Street, playing in the year 1894. It was during renovations at our old Baker Street lodgings that a most curious trunk was unearthed from the attic. Within lay not dusty relics, but a collection of personal diaries and letters. These intimate accounts, penned by women whose lives intersected with Holmes's investigations between 1888 and 1914, offer a rather different perspective to my own chronicles. They reveal the societal constraints these remarkable individuals navigated, often defying Victorian norms in an era of emerging feminism, and how they frequently challenged Holmes himself. This collection, which one might call the feminine mystique, Sherlock Holmes and the Women of Baker Street, illuminates their untold influence. Let us now turn to the first of these remarkable narratives. I shall recount for you the particulars of a most perplexing affair, known as the case of the Whispering Walls. Chapter 1. The November air pressed against our windows at 221B Baker Street. It was thick with the scent of coal smoke and damp wool. A persistent drizzle had set in. Its dreary patter on the glass accompanied the distant rumble of hansoms on the cobbled street below. Holmes had been sunk in profound silence for most of the morning. Suddenly, he straightened in his armchair, his keen eyes fixed upon the street. His voice, when it came, was unexpectedly brisk. "A client, Watson, or I am much mistaken. One who approaches with a measure of trepidation, yet also with a determined step. Observe the hesitation at the curb, now overcome." Sherlock Holmes responded. Before I could make my own observations, a sharp rap echoed from our front door. Mrs. Hudson's measured tread followed shortly in the passage. She announced a Miss Martha Scrubbs, who wished for a private consultation. The young woman who entered was plainly but neatly dressed. Her bonnet was slightly askew, and she clasped her hands tightly before her. She had the air of an earnest, country-bred girl, yet her gaze was direct and intelligent. Her voice was low and trembled slightly as she began. "Mr. Holmes, sir, Dr. Watson, forgive my boldness. I come on behalf of my mistress, Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle, and from the sisterhood, sir, the Baker Street Irregulars Sisterhood," remarked Martha Scrubbs. Holmes raised an eyebrow. A flicker of interest showed in his eyes. The mention of his unofficial informants, now apparently with a female contingent, was an intriguing development. He gestured towards a chair. "Pray be seated, Miss Scrubbs. The sisterhood, you say, an intriguing development. And what troubles Mrs. Periwinkle so gravely as to require your intercession?" Sherlock Holmes noted. The girl perched on the edge of the seat. Her story tumbled out in a rush. Her initial nervousness gave way to passionate advocacy for her employer. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, it's her new house in Mayfair. She's terrified, sir, truly terrified. She hears whispers, sir, voices when no one is there. Things move, shadows flicker where they shouldn't. She's a good woman, kind and gentle, but this is driving her to distraction. She believes the house is haunted," responded Martha Scrubbs. I saw Holmes's lips tighten almost imperceptibly. It was his usual expression when confronted with tales of the supernatural. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "And the police, Miss Scrubbs? Surely they have been consulted in a matter of such spectral disturbance," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. There was a dry note in his voice. A flush rose on Martha's cheeks. "She did report it, sir, but they didn't believe her. She was very upset, naturally, and perhaps didn't explain it well. And her nephew, Mr. Silas Blackwood, was there. He spoke to the inspector afterwards very smoothly. He suggested she was overwrought, grieving for her late husband. He implied her nerves were not to be trusted. There was no evidence, they said, just a frightened lady's fancies," remarked Martha Scrubbs. Martha's earnestness was palpable. She leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "But it's not fancy, Mr. Holmes. I've heard them too, faintly, and seen her face. The terror is real. She's wasting away from fear. The sisterhood, we thought you might see past what others dismiss, answered Martha Scrubbs. Holmes fell silent, his piercing gaze fixed on the young woman. Only the fire's crackle and rain's drumming broke the stillness. I watched his face, seeing him weigh the girl's sincerity against her improbable tale. "These whispers, Miss Scrubbs," he said at last, his skepticism fading, "are they clear? Do you hear words or just murmurs? And where do they seem to come from?" remarked Sherlock Holmes. "Sometimes just murmurs, sir, like wind in a chimney, but other times Mrs. Periwinkle says they call her name, or speak of secrets. They seem to come from the walls themselves, sir, from everywhere and nowhere," responded Martha Scrubbs. Holmes nodded slowly. Martha Scrubbs's unwavering conviction had evidently struck a chord. The mention of a nephew keen to discredit his aunt was also significant. The police dismissal, possibly influenced by family interference, suggested a tangible problem, not merely spectral visitations. He mused, a new light dawning in his eyes. A house that whispers, a distressed widow, and a concerned nephew. You have presented your case with admirable clarity and loyalty, Miss Scrubbs. The dismissal by the constabulary is not altogether surprising, given the circumstances you describe. Tell me more of this, Mr. Blackwood, and of the layout of this intriguing Mayfair residence, replied Sherlock Holmes. It was clear that the game was once more afoot. The spectral had given way to the suspicious. Holmes's interest was thoroughly engaged. Our quiet morning had been dispelled. It was replaced by the first faint stirrings of a new and perplexing investigation. Our carriage halted before a grand yet sombre mansion in a secluded Mayfair square. An unseasonable chill clung to the grey stone, while tall, narrow windows gazed down like hollow eyes. Even before the heavy oak door creaked open to admit us, a profound silence emanated from within. This silence seemed to swallow the distant rumble of city traffic, leaving an impression of utter isolation. A housemaid, not Martha Scrubbs, but an older woman with a perpetually worried frown, showed us into a vast drawing room. Here, the gloom was even more pronounced, heavy velvet curtains obscuring much of the daylight. Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle rose to greet us from a wing-backed chair near a meagre fire. She was a pale, slight woman, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her voice, when she spoke, was little more than a breathy whisper, tinged with a tremor she could not quite control. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming. I scarcely know where to begin. It is this house. It speaks," Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle answered. Her eyes, wide and dark-rimmed, darted towards the shadowed corners of the room, as if expecting some immediate confirmation of her words. I confess, a shiver traced its way down my own spine. This was a response not merely to the chill of the room, but to the palpable dread that radiated from our hostess. It was difficult not to feel a profound sympathy, and indeed a growing concern for her agitated state. Whispers, sirs, from the walls themselves, sometimes names, sometimes just mocking laughter. And things move, small objects. A book from its shelf, a teacup displaced. The servants think me mad, I know they do. The police, they were polite but dismissive. Holmes, who had listened with his customary stillness, his keen gaze fixed upon Mrs. Periwinkle, now rose. He made no immediate comment on her tale, but began a slow perambulation of the room. His eyes scanned the ornate cornices, the heavy picture frames, the very pattern of the wallpaper. He stooped to examine the skirting boards and tapped lightly upon the paneled walls. He paused for a considerable time before an old, disused bell-pull, its frayed rope hanging limply. The only sounds were the faint rustle of his movements and the almost inaudible sigh of a draught from beneath the door. "This house is of a considerable age, Mrs. Periwinkle, and built, I perceive, with a certain complexity. Such grand structures often possess antiquated systems, remnants of past conveniences," explained Sherlock Holmes. "Indeed, Mr. Holmes, My late husband mentioned it was one of the older properties in the square. He, he never experienced these disturbances, Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle said. I watched Holmes continue his silent scrutiny. His attention was drawn to a series of brass fixtures near the fireplace, which I vaguely recognized as speaking tube covers, though long out of fashion. The oppressive quiet of the mansion seemed to deepen. It was broken only by the distant, mournful cry of a street vendor, a sound that seemed to accentuate our isolation within these shadowy walls. My concern for Mrs. Periwinkle's mental equilibrium grew. The atmosphere alone was enough to unnerve the most robust constitution. The whispers you hear, madam, are they localized to this room, or do they manifest elsewhere? Remarked Sherlock Holmes. Everywhere, Mr. Holmes. The passage is my bedroom. It is relentless. Sometimes louder, sometimes fainter, but always there, Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle said. Holmes nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping the room one last time. The very air seemed thick with unspoken secrets, and I could almost imagine the walls themselves holding their breath. He turned back to our distressed client. A flicker of something, not quite sympathy, but perhaps focused interest, was visible in his eyes. Your account is most singular, Mrs. Periwinkle. Watson and I shall need to understand the unique constitution of this dwelling. Its history, its very architecture, may hold the key. These old houses often conceal more than just dust and memories, replied Sherlock Holmes. His words, though offering a path forward, did little to dispel the chilling miasma of the place. As we took our leave, the great door closed behind us with a sonorous thud that echoed in the sudden stillness of the square. I could not shake the image of Mrs. Periwinkle, a solitary figure lost in the gloom of her whispering prison. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated, the hunt truly begun. The mansions past, it was clear, would be our next port of call. Dawn had barely broken when Holmes roused me, his eyes alight with purpose. To the archives, Watson, he declared. Mrs. Periwinkle's plight demands our immediate attention, stated Sherlock Holmes. We found ourselves within the hushed confines of the local archives, a repository of crumbling ledgers and forgotten histories. The air hung thick with the scent of aged paper and binding glue, a fine dust coating every surface, stirred only by our movements or the occasional sigh of a draught from beneath the ill-fitting windows. Outside, the muted rumble of London's traffic seemed a world away. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low hum of concentration, barely disturbing the silence. The provenance of a house, Watson, particularly one of such singular construction as Mrs. Periwinkle's, often holds the key to its present mysteries, Sherlock Holmes said. For what seemed an eternity, the archives echoed only with the rustle of pages and scratch of Holmes's pencil. Then, suddenly, he straightened with a triumphant, aha. Ah, precisely as I suspected. The original designs for the Periwinkle property, or rather, the Blackwood family seat as it was then, bear the unmistakable influence of one Horatio Blackwood, deduced Sherlock Holmes. He tapped a spidery annotation on a brittle diagram, the parchment crinkling faintly under his touch. An ancestor of some eccentricity who lived in the early part of this century. He possessed, it is documented, a profound interest in theatrical illusions and most significantly acoustics, stated Sherlock Holmes. Holmes's finger traced another line on the aged plans. There are even notes here, appended to the architectural plans, detailing peculiar resonant chambers, and if I interpret this correctly, a rudimentary system of speaking tubes, long since disused and likely forgotten. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. From another folder, he produced a sheaf of brittle, yellowed papers, not merely a letter, but what appeared to be a meticulously recorded statement, its creases fragile, the paper whispering as he handled it. Indeed, this is a transcript of an inquiry made some years ago with a former head groundskeeper, one Mr. Josiah Higgs, now long deceased, who served Horatio Blackwood for over 2 decades. Higgs spoke with considerable agitation, even in this dry record of whispers from solid walls and disembodied sighs in the dead of night. Particularly prevalent, he noted, in the west wing and near the grand fireplace in the master study. He recounted how other staff fled, convinced the house was haunted, but Higgs, a man of more practical bent, suspected some devilish contrivance of the master's, linking it directly to Blackwood's known fascination with stagecraft, and, as he put it, making the unseen heard. A most illuminating testimony, Watson, Sherlock Holmes noted. It would seem, Watson, that if Mr. Silas Blackwood had access to such family records, and it is highly probable he would, he possesses a unique understanding of this house's hidden capabilities, a veritable blueprint for deception. Sherlock Holmes said. The implications were chilling. While Holmes methodically pursued the physical evidence of a cruel trick, my mind remained troubled by the profound psychological distress inflicted upon Mrs. Periwinkle. It was this concern that led me, later that afternoon, to seek the counsel of Dr. Elizabeth Hartley. Her consulting rooms, a quiet haven off Harley Street, offered a stark contrast to the dusty archives. Here, the only sounds were the steady, reassuring tick of a handsome mantel clock and the distant, softened hum of the city, a backdrop to calm professionalism. I had made her acquaintance through Mrs. Hudson's rather progressive suffragist salon. Dr. Hartley, I began, after she had greeted me with a courteous inclination of her head. I find myself in need of your particular expertise concerning a lady whose mental fortitude is being sorely tested. Dr. John Watson replied. I recounted the strange occurrences at the Mayfair mansion and Mrs. Periwinkle's terrified reactions, omitting Holmes's more speculative theories regarding deliberate manipulation for the moment. Dr. Hartley listened intently, her intelligent gaze never wavering, the quiet of her office punctuated only by the low murmur of my voice and the occasional soft rustle of her skirt as she shifted position. Her reply was measured, her voice clear and thoughtful. Dr. Watson, the term female hysteria is too often a convenient label, applied without due consideration for the genuine impact of environmental stressors or, indeed, deliberate cruelty. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley said. She paused, her gaze steady, allowing her words to settle. The mantel clock ticked rhythmically, a quiet counterpoint to the gravity of her assessment. A sensitive mind, subjected to prolonged anxiety and inexplicable phenomena within her own home, a place that should be a sanctuary, can indeed exhibit symptoms that might be hastily dismissed. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley said, we must consider the cumulative effect of isolation, fear, and the erosion of one's own sense of reality. Such pressures can be immense. Her words offered a compassionate and scientific perspective that resonated deeply. It was clear that Mrs. Periwinkle was caught between the tangible machinations Holmes was beginning to uncover and the insidious assault on her very sanity. As I stepped out from the quietude of Dr. Hartley's rooms, the sounds of Harley Street, the clip-clop of hooves on cobblestone, the distant call of a vendor seemed to reassert themselves, pulling me back into the city's urgent rhythm. The complexities of the case seemed to multiply with each passing moment, and I felt a growing sense of foreboding regarding the forces, both seen and unseen, arrayed against the unfortunate widow. The arrival of her nephew, Mr. Silas Blackwood, was now an event I anticipated with considerable apprehension. Dr. Hartley's sensible words concerning the pressures upon the female constitution still echoed in my mind as Holmes, and I found ourselves once more within the oppressive silence of Mrs. Periwinkle's Mayfair residence. The previous day's discoveries regarding the mansion's peculiar architecture and its connection to a Blackwood ancestor with a penchant for theatrical illusion had lent a new, more tangible dimension to the disquieting mystery. We were seated in the drawing-room. The air hung heavy with the scent of beeswax and old grievances. Suddenly, The distant clatter of hooves and carriage wheels on the cobbled street outside announced an arrival. Shortly thereafter, a sharp summons from the door-knocker reverberated through the house, breaking the stillness. Mrs. Periwinkle started, her hands fluttering to her chest. Martha, the young housemaid, entered to announce the visitor, and soon after, Mr. Silas Blackwood was ushered in. He was a man of perhaps 40 years, dressed in a dark suit that, whilst respectable, seemed to have seen better days. The cuffs, I noted, were a trifle frayed. His countenance was arranged in lines of sober concern. His voice was smooth, almost unctuous. "My dearest Aunt Agnes, I came as soon as I received your troubling letter. You must know how deeply concerned I am for your well-being," Mr. Silas Blackwood said. Her own voice trembled slightly. "Silas, how kind of you to make the journey. These gentlemen, Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson, they are attempting to understand these dreadful occurrences," responded Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle. Blackwood inclined his head towards us, a polite but unreadable expression in his eyes. Holmes, who had risen, observed him with that peculiar stillness which so often heralded a period of intense scrutiny. His tone was neutral, yet carried an edge of inquiry. "Mr. Blackwood, your aunt has indeed been experiencing some unsettling occurrences," Sherlock Holmes responded. "Unsettling, you say? Poor Aunt Agnes, her nerves have always been delicate. This grand old house, so full of memories, perhaps it is too much for her. I recall wandering these corridors as a boy. It's easy to imagine things, especially in the East Wing Gallery, always a gloomy spot, that. And the old dumbwaiter shaft near the north staircase, I remember thinking it led to all sorts of secret places. One must be careful not to let the imagination run wild in such a vast, old pile," Mr. Silas Blackwood said. I saw Holmes's eyebrow lift almost imperceptibly. The East Wing Gallery was indeed a less frequented part of the mansion, and the mention of the old dumbwaiter shaft near the north staircase, a feature I myself had not yet noted, was particularly striking. Blackwood gestured vaguely towards a side passage, one not immediately obvious from the main drawing-room, with an air of confident, almost proprietary familiarity that seemed at odds with a mere childhood recollection of wandering corridors. She sighed, a sound like rustling leaves. "Oh, Silas, if only it were merely imagination. But the whispers, they are so terribly, terribly real. I hear them, you see, even when I try not to," remarked Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle. He patted her hand, his voice softening with a practiced sympathy. There, Aunt, we must take excellent care of you. Perhaps a change of air. My own affairs are rather straitened at present, alas, or I should insist you come to me. Investments, you know, are a fickle mistress these days," responded Mr. Silas Blackwood. Holmes's gaze lingered on Blackwood for a moment longer, then swept the room. Later, as Mrs. Periwinkle was briefly called away by Martha concerning some household matter, the young maid paused by Holmes on her return. Her voice was low and hurried. "Sir, Mr. Blackwood. He's been here twice before this past month, before Mrs. Periwinkle even wrote to him. Asking after her health, he said, but also about her finances, sir. Quite particular he was," said Martha Scrubbs. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Martha. That is most illuminating," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Blackwood departed, promising to call again soon. Mrs. Periwinkle, overcome by a nervous headache, retired to her rooms, leaving a palpable tension in the air. Holmes then began to pace the drawing-room. The floorboards creaked softly under his tread, each step a measured beat in the otherwise quiet space. In the ensuing quiet, the only other sound was the rhythmic tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall. "Well, Holmes," I ventured, "what make you of our Mr. Blackwood? His concern seems genuine enough, if a little effusive." Dr. John Watson replied, "His concern, Watson, is a garment hastily tailored, with poor stitching indeed. Did you note his familiarity with the house? It far exceeds mere childhood recollection, and is reinforcement of Mrs. Periwinkle's supposed hysteria. How convenient, aligning so neatly with the police's dismissal. Then there are those pointed remarks about his finances, curiously coupled with his prior inquiries into his aunt's affairs. "No, Watson, there's more here than meets the eye," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. He turned, his eyes bright with intellectual fire. "No, Watson, Mr. Blackwood is playing a part, and I suspect he knows more of these whispers than he admits. His performance today was designed to allay suspicion, yet it has merely deepened mine. Tomorrow we shall delve into the very fabric of this building. I have a growing conviction that the secrets we seek are embedded not in the supernatural, but in the bricks and mortar and perhaps in the ingenuity of a Blackwood ancestor," replied Sherlock Holmes. As I contemplated the exploration of the mansion's hidden recesses, a shiver of anticipation coursed through me. Holmes' eyes gleamed with excitement. The game, as he would say, was most decidedly afoot. Mr. Silas Blackwood's departure left an air thick with unspoken questions. A residue of unease remained, which even Holmes's brisk energy could not entirely dispel. Blackwood's earlier remarks about his aunt's fragile nerves echoed unpleasantly, casting a deliberate shadow upon Mrs. Periwinkle's already troubled state. An interesting study, that young man, Watson. A peculiar blend of solicitude and, shall we say, an almost proprietary familiarity with this grand, yet somewhat decaying edifice, explained Sherlock Holmes. As Blackwood's carriage rumbled into the distance, Holmes's voice cut through the quiet of the morning room. "Now, Watson, let us examine this curious abode," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. He said this, his eyes gleaming. With that, he launched into his investigation of the mansion. I heard the light tap-tap-tapping of his knuckles against wainscoting. An occasional soft scrape marked his penknife tracing a floorboard joint. Faint rustles came from ancient draperies, disturbed after long stillness. The house itself seemed to sigh around us. Its timbers creaked, strained by age and perhaps by its secrets. In the library, Holmes paused before ornate wooden paneling. The cavernous chamber was lined with books, their scent of dry leather and fading ink filling the air. "Ah," deduced Sherlock Holmes. He murmured the sound, his eyes gleaming with that familiar light of discovery. He pressed a particular rosette, and with a faint click, a small, circular brass plate, no larger than a shilling, sprang open, revealing a dark aperture. "A speaking tube, Watson. An archaic method of communication, but remarkably effective for its time, and I suspect still quite capable of conveying whispers." I peered into the opening. A faint, musty odor emanated from its depths. Holmes, meanwhile, had moved to the far side of the room. There, a similar, though less obvious, grill was set low into the wall. He blew a sharp puff of air into the tube he had discovered. Standing by the second grill, I distinctly heard the rush of air, faint but undeniable. "You see, Watson, sound travels, and if these tubes crisscross the house, as I suspect they do, connecting disparate rooms, then a voice introduced at one end could well appear disembodied and mysterious at another. Note the dust, or rather, the subtle lack of it around this particular orifice. Recently disturbed, I'd wager," observed Sherlock Holmes. Holmes's voice was crisp with satisfaction. He then requested the presence of Martha Scrubbs. She was the young housemaid whose initial report, via the Baker Street Irregulars Sisterhood, had first brought this case to us. Martha entered quietly, her footsteps barely audible on the thick Persian rug. She was a neat, observant girl, with an air of quiet competence. "Miss Scrubbs, your knowledge of this house's daily life is invaluable. Tell me, who amongst the staff, or indeed any visitors, would have cause or opportunity to be in the more disused portions of the house, or perhaps who has shown an undue interest in its older features?" Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Holmes's tone was courteous but direct. Martha considered for a moment, her brow furrowed. Well, sir, we mostly stick to the main floors. The old north wing, that's closed off. Mr. Blackwood used to explore there as a boy, but that was long ago. These days, no one goes there, sir. At least, I haven't seen anyone. But those noises, we all hear them, of course, said Martha Scrubbs. Martha's voice, clear and steady for the most part, faltered slightly on her last word. It was then, as if summoned by her very words, that the phenomenon occurred. We stood in the grand hallway. Its vaulted ceiling was lost in shadows above. The only sound was the distant tick-tock of a grandfather clock. Suddenly, a low, sibilant whisper seemed to breathe from the very walls around us. It was not a word, not a sentence, but a chilling, indeterminate murmur, formless, yet undeniably present. A prickle of genuine unease traced its way down my own spine. The hairs on my neck stirred. The sound was faint, yet it filled the vast space with a palpable sense of dread. "Good heavens, Holmes! Did you hear that?" Dr. John Watson commented. I exclaimed, my voice perhaps a little louder than I intended. Holmes had not moved. His head was cocked, his eyes narrowed. He fixed his gaze on a point somewhere on the ornate plasterwork above the main staircase. There was no fear in his expression, only an intense, almost predatory concentration. The silence that followed the sound's end was heavier, more charged than any before. A carriage rumbled past on the street outside. Its passage was a momentary, mundane intrusion. Indeed, Watson, a most effective demonstration. The acoustics of this hallway, combined with a well-placed speaking tube outlet, or perhaps a cleverly concealed passage behind the lath and plaster, it becomes clearer. The architect of these illusions is no phantom, but a flesh-and-blood trickster with a keen understanding of this old house's bones. Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. His voice remained low and thoughtful as he concluded. He then tapped a section of the wall pensively. "The next step, Watson, is to understand the currents that flow within these walls, the human currents. We must speak with the entire household staff. Their collective experiences, even their fears, may yet illuminate the darker corners of this affair." The chilling echo of those disembodied whispers still seemed to cling to the air as Holmes and I, led by Martha Scrubbs, descended the narrow backstairs into the servants' domain. The contrast from the oppressive silence of the upper floors was stark. Here, a more mundane clatter of pans and the distant murmur of kitchen activity, though an undercurrent of unease was palpable. The passage to the kitchen itself, cool against the skin, smelt strongly of boiled cabbage and damp, cold stone. Holmes addressed Martha directly. "Miss Scrubbs, your assistance is invaluable. We must speak with each member of the staff. Their daily observations may hold the key." Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Martha nodded. "A mixed sort, Mr. Holmes. Some easily spooked, others blame old house noises. I've told them you're here about the disturbances," replied Martha Scrubbs. "Our first interview was with Mrs. Higgins, the cook, a stout woman with flour dusting her ample apron. We found her in a large, warm kitchen where steam hissed from a great copper kettle on a black iron range. She wiped her hands on her apron, her round face skeptical. Her voice, when she finally spoke, rumbled from deep within her chest. "Whispers and shadows, sir. This old house has drafts. I'm more troubled by the butcher's last delivery," Mrs. Higgins said. Holmes pressed gently. "Indeed, but have you noted anything out of the ordinary, a particular sound or a feeling?" replied Sherlock Holmes. She sniffed. "Only the feeling I'm watched when the souffle falls. The pipes gurgle, always have," Mrs. Higgins answered. Next, Martha led us along a flagged passage to a small, chilly pantry where a young footman, James, was meticulously polishing silver. He started visibly at our entrance, the chamois cloth slipping from his grasp to fall with a soft thud onto the stone floor. James exclaimed, his voice quavering, "Oh, Mr. Holmes, sir, it's most unsettling. Last Tuesday I heard a sighing from the wall near the main staircase. and there's a cold spot there, sir, even when fires are blazing in every hearth," answered James. Holmes leaned in slightly, his interest piqued. "A cold spot, and this sighing distinct," Sherlock Holmes responded. "Like a woman weeping, but not quite human. And sometimes a shadow flits past in the hall," said James. He glanced nervously over his shoulder. "We found Sarah, the scullery maid, in a dim corner of the kitchen. The rhythmic scrape of her brush on parts was the only sound until we approached. She looked up, her face pale, her red, raw hands pausing mid-scrub. When she spoke, it was in a mere whisper. 'The nights, sir, are worst, when all's quiet. You hear them then, tappings and whispers from inside the walls, mostly the mistress's wing, sometimes like someone dragging something,' Sarah said. Thus, a pattern of disparate experiences began to emerge from our inquiries, yet woven through them was a consistent thread: reports of nocturnal disturbances. Martha confirmed this as we stood once more in the cool, stone-flagged passage, the distant, sharp clang of a dropped pot echoing from the kitchen. Martha elaborated, her expression earnest. "They bicker, sir. Some say Sarah imagines things because she reads too many penny dreadfuls. But the sounds from the walls at night are reported by more than one, even if they describe them differently," Martha Scrubbs answered. Holmes nodded slowly, his fingers steepled. "Precisely, Miss Scrubbs. The cook rationalizes. James gives sensory details, cold spot, sighing, shadows, classic elements. Sarah, however, adds a crucial detail: nocturnal sounds from within the walls near Mrs. Periwinkle's rooms, including a dragging sound. Most suggestive," observed Sherlock Holmes. He paced the confines of the narrow service corridor for a moment, the ancient floorboards creaking softly beneath his measured tread. He paused in his pacing, his gaze thoughtful. Variation in testimony is expected. Fear and personal interpretation color such accounts. Yet, the consistency regarding the source and timing of the more distinct sounds, the whispers and dragging from the walls at night, cannot be ignored. It points away from simple drafts or common household creaks. Sherlock Holmes responded. "So, you believe there is deliberate human agency at work, Holmes, despite the spectral descriptions," remarked Dr. John Watson. I asked, the memory of the chilling whispers we ourselves had heard still vivid. He replied thoughtfully, "The human mind is a remarkable instrument, Watson, capable of conjuring terrors from the slightest suggestion, especially when isolated and distressed. But it is also capable of orchestrating elaborate deceptions. These disturbances, the way they seem designed to prey upon Mrs. Periwinkle's peace of mind, suggest a cruel and calculated campaign," declared Sherlock Holmes. A deep sigh escaped me. The thought of such calculated cruelty, aimed at a vulnerable widow, was deeply unsettling. The conflicting testimonies, while pointing towards a tangible source, also starkly highlighted the psychological torment Mrs. Periwinkle must be enduring. Holmes's brow was furrowed, his gaze distant. I sensed his mind already leaping ahead, considering not just the mechanics of the deception, but the very nature of the mind that conceived it and the mind it sought to break. Indeed, the psychological dimension of this peculiar case was rapidly becoming paramount. The myriad testimonies from Mrs. Periwinkle's staff, a confusing blend of the mundane and the unsettling, still echoed in my mind as Holmes, with an unusual alacrity, accepted an invitation from Mrs. Hudson. Our landlady, it transpired, was hosting one of her regular suffragist salon evenings, and had particularly urged Holmes to attend, hinting that a certain Dr. Elizabeth Hartley would be speaking on matters that might prove pertinent to his current inquiries. The rumble of a late afternoon omnibus faded as we stepped into the familiar warmth of Mrs. Hudson's private parlor, a room transformed by the animated presence of a dozen or so ladies, and the low, persistent murmur of their discourse. The air was thick with the scent of brewed tea and beeswax polish, punctuated by the occasional delicate clink of porcelain. Mrs. Hudson herself greeted us, her customary warmth tinged with the importance of the occasion. Her voice, usually reserved for domestic pronouncements, carried a note of proprietorial pride as she spoke. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am so pleased you could make it. We are all on the very edge of our seats for Dr. Hartley's address. I fancy her insights will prove most pertinent this evening," responded Mrs. Hudson. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, a woman of keen, intelligent eyes and a composed demeanor, stood near the fireplace, its gentle crackle a counterpoint to the earnest discussion already underway. The topic, it seemed, was the regrettable tendency of society, and indeed the medical profession, to dismiss the anxieties of women as mere hysteria or fancy. One of the salon members voiced what many were thinking, her tone earnest and tinged with frustration. "It is as if our very perceptions are deemed unreliable by default, particularly when subjected to distress," Salon member one said. Another added, her words sharp with agreement, "And any persistent account of unusual or unsettling experiences is labeled a symptom of a fragile feminine constitution," answered Salon member two. Holmes, seated somewhat apart, fixed his gaze upon Dr. Hartley, listening with an intensity unusual for him in general discussions. After a brief acknowledgment from Mrs. Hudson, Dr. Hartley inclined her head slightly towards us. Her voice, clear and measured, cut through the preceding chatter with quiet authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Hartley began, her voice carrying a weight of authority, "we are not today discussing fleeting fancies, but rather calculated and insidious campaigns. These are designed to systematically undermine reason, to isolate through fear, and to induce a state often misdiagnosed as inherent madness. Such prolonged mental cruelty, this preying upon the mind, can indeed be devastating," responded Dr. Elizabeth Hartley. A hush fell over the room, broken only by the soft hiss of gas lamps and a distant newsboy's cry. Dr. Hartley elaborated on methods of creating terror and self-doubt, manipulating environments and exploiting vulnerabilities, all without physical violence, yet inflicting profound psychological harm. I glanced at Holmes. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of understanding, or perhaps recognition, animating his usually impassive features. Dr. Hartley continued, her voice firm and unwavering. "The perpetrator of such a scheme is not merely mischievous, but exhibits a chilling patience and a deep, often malignant, understanding of human frailty. Their aim is to make the victim doubt their own senses, their own sanity, until they are entirely dependent or discredited." Dr. Elizabeth Hartley answered. The discussion that followed was spirited, yet Dr. Hartley's words seemed to hang in the air, resonating with a particular gravity. As the gathering began to disperse, the scrape of chairs and the renewed hum of conversation filling the room, Holmes rose. He addressed Dr. Hartley directly, his tone one of professional respect. "Your exposition, Doctor, upon the architecture of such psychological sieges has been most clarifying. It lends a specific structure to what might otherwise appear as random, inexplicable torments," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. Dr. Hartley met his gaze squarely. Her expression acknowledged the shared understanding of such dark methodologies as she replied, "Indeed, Mr. Holmes, the patterns are there if one knows how to look beyond the surface distress and examine the method. The cruelty is in the design," said Dr. Elizabeth Hartley. Later, we walked back towards Baker Street. The sky was bruised with the remnants of sunset, gas lamps blooming in the twilight. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent for several blocks. In the evening air, the clatter of our boot heels on the pavement seemed unusually loud. Finally, Holmes broke the silence, his voice thoughtful as he pieced together the implications of the evening's discourse. The accounts of the staff at the Periwinkle house, Watson, the fleeting shadows, the specific cold spots, the sounds from within the walls, viewed through the lens Dr. Hartley provided, they ceased to be mere oddities. They suggest not a spectral presence, but a human one, possessed of a calculating mind and a motive that necessitates the utter discrediting of Mrs. Periwinkle. Sherlock Holmes pointed out. So you believe it is a deliberate plot to drive her to distraction? Dr. John Watson replied. I asked, the chill of the evening air suddenly feeling more pronounced at the thought. Holmes nodded, his profile sharp against the glow of a nearby tobacconist's window. Precisely, and a plot of some ingenuity, leveraging the very structure of the house, it would seem. Our next step, Watson, is clear. We must observe these phenomena for ourselves, within the very walls that whisper. We shall keep vigil at Mrs. Periwinkle's mansion, observed Sherlock Holmes. His words, promising a direct confrontation with the unknown, cast an unnerving new light on our task. The game, as Holmes often termed it, was taking a decidedly more personal and insidious turn. The great Mayfair mansion settled into a profound silence, a stark contrast to the turmoil within its mistress. Holmes and I had taken up our self-appointed watch in the cavernous drawing-room. The gas lamps turned low, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. A chill, not entirely of the night air, permeated the room, and the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn from the Thames seemed to underscore the oppressive atmosphere. Nearby, Mrs. Periwinkle, a portrait of frayed nerves and sleepless dread, sat huddled in a large armchair. A fine cashmere shawl was drawn tightly about her, less for warmth than as a fragile shield against the unseen terrors that plagued her. Her face, pale in the dim light, was etched with lines of anxiety, and her eyes, though heavy with exhaustion, darted nervously at every flicker of shadow, every creak of the ancient house. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low murmur, yet it cut through the silence with its usual precision. Patience, Watson. The proscenium is set. The players will soon make their entrance. Sherlock Holmes responded. It was not long before the first manifestation occurred. A faint, sighing whisper seemed to breathe from the direction of the heavy velvet curtains. It was indistinct, yet undeniably present, a sound that sent a shiver down my own spine. Mrs. Periwinkle gasped, a choked sound of pure dread, her hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes, already wide with a persistent fear, now seemed to bulge with a fresh wave of terror, her knuckles white as she gripped the arms of her chair, her whole body trembling. Holmes observed. Note the quality, Watson. A touch of the melodramatic, would you not agree, almost as if intended for an audience, replied Sherlock Holmes. While I confess the sound had a more unnerving effect on me, Holmes rose silently and moved towards the curtains. He did not draw them, but instead ran his fingers lightly along the heavy pelmet above, his gaze sharp and focused. He then stooped to examine the floorboards nearby, his expression thoughtful. He murmured, more to himself than to me. Curious. The dust here is disturbed in a most peculiar fashion, and there is the faintest, almost imperceptible scoring upon the wood, as if from a fine wire. Before I could query him further, a small porcelain figurine upon the mantelpiece trembled, then slowly, inexplicably, tilted and fell with a soft thud onto the hearthrug. Mrs. Periwinkle let out a stifled cry, a sound of utter despair, as if this small, malevolent act was the final confirmation of her descent into madness. She buried her face in her hands for a moment, her shoulders shaking, a silent testament to her anguish. Holmes stated calmly, retrieving the figurine. Again, observe the performance. No sudden jolt, no violent overthrow. It was a gentle, almost guided descent. Such delicacy suggests a careful hand, Watson, not a spectral force, explained Sherlock Holmes. He pointed to a minuscule, almost invisible filament of what looked like silk, clinging to the base of the figurine. My eyes widened as the implication of his discovery began to dawn upon me. This was no haunting. It was a meticulously crafted deception. The hours wore on, marked by the occasional creak of the ancient house settling around us. Through it all, Mrs. Periwinkle remained a tense, silent figure in her chair, starting at every sound, her breathing shallow, a woman stretched taut on the rack of her own fear. Suddenly, a new sound intruded, the soft, hesitant patter of footsteps in the hallway. It was Mrs. Periwinkle. The poor woman, evidently driven beyond the limits of her endurance by the oppressive silence and the lingering fear, could no longer remain confined to the adjoining parlor where we had urged her to rest. The strain of waiting, of not knowing, of imagining fresh horrors in every shadow, had clearly become unbearable. Her voice, when it reached us, was a mere whisper, thin and reedy, laced with an almost unbearable anxiety. "Oh, heavens, is anyone present?" I distinctly heard a most unsettling, dragging noise, responded Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle. Holmes immediately held up a hand for silence, his body tensing. Footsteps approached the library opposite us, its door slightly ajar. From within came a faint, almost inaudible metallic click, followed by a stifled rustle of fabric. Mrs. Periwinkle paused directly outside the library door, her silhouette framed by the faint light from the hall. She stood there for a long moment, indecisive, her head tilted as if straining to hear, to understand, her posture radiating a mixture of trepidation and a desperate need for answers. Her voice quavered with a refined terror, the sound of a gentlewoman pushed to her absolute limit, yet still clinging to the hope of a familiar presence. "Who is there?" "It is I, Mrs. Periwinkle." "Martha, child, is that you?" answered Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle. Silence answered her. For a heart-stopping moment, I feared she would push the door open and confront whatever or whoever lurked within. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all her accumulated fear and crushing disappointment, she seemed to dismiss the notion. Perhaps the thought of confronting an unknown horror alone was too much, or perhaps a sliver of doubt about her own senses, cruelly instilled by weeks of torment, resurfaced. A faint shuffle indicated she was turning away, a slow, reluctant movement of profound weariness and lingering dread. No sooner had her footsteps begun to recede down the passage than we heard the faintest creak of a floorboard from the far side of the library. This was followed by the almost silent snick of a latch, a sound that suggested a discreet and hurried departure through a secondary exit. As the sounds of Mrs. Periwinkle retreating to her room faded, Holmes observed, his voice low and thoughtful, "A narrow escape for our phantom, and a most instructive one for us. The artist grows careless, Watson, or perhaps overconfident," replied Sherlock Holmes. He stood for a moment, gazing towards the library door, a gleam of understanding in his eyes. The pieces were evidently falling into place for him. The whispers, the moving objects, the near discovery. It all pointed towards a carefully orchestrated campaign of terror. The methods employed were becoming increasingly clear to my companion. The theatricality he had noted was not merely a stylistic flourish. It was the very essence of the scheme. As the grey light of dawn seeped through the tall, grimy windows of the Mayfair mansion, the creak of floorboards announced Holmes was already at work. The near discovery of the miscreant during our vigil the previous night had lent a new urgency to his movements. He had established a makeshift laboratory in a disused morning room, the air already tinged with the faint, acrid scent of chemicals and the occasional, sharp tang of ozone. I found him hunched over a collection of notes and a small, rather grubby ledger, his brow furrowed in concentration. The only sounds were the scratch of his pen, the occasional clink of glass vials from his experiments, and the distant, mournful cry of a gull from the direction of the Thames. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and thoughtful. "The threads are beginning to weave themselves into a discernible pattern, Watson, a pattern of calculated theatrical malevolence," Sherlock Holmes said. As if on cue, a light tap at the door announced a visitor. It was a young woman, neat and resolute, whom I recognized as one of the more active members of what Holmes referred to as his Baker Street Irregulars Sisterhood. She carried a small, oilskin-wrapped parcel. Mr. Holmes, sir, she began, her voice clear despite a certain breathlessness. We've traced the purchases as you asked, from several theatrical costumers and suppliers of stage effects in the Haymarket and Seven Dials. Here is the list and receipts where they could be obtained, responded member of the Baker Street Irregulars Sisterhood. Holmes took the proffered ledger and papers, his eyes gleaming with keen interest. He spread them across the table, a faint smile playing on his lips as he scanned the contents. The clinking of a bottle from his chemical array punctuated the silence as he gestured towards the list. "Excellent work, my dear," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. Holmes turned to me, his eyes alight with discovery. "Watson, note the purchases. Phosphorus paste, the source of Mrs. Periwinkle's spectral glows. And here, exceptionally fine, dark-annealed wire, almost invisible, yet ideal for manipulating objects from afar. Can you not picture it, Watson? Objects swaying, falling, as if moved by ghostly hands," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. "Phosphorus, of course, that would explain the eerie luminescence she reported with such distress," commented Dr. John Watson. I peered at the list. Indeed, the items were innocuous enough in isolation, yet taken together, they painted a sinister picture. The ingenuity of the deception was as chilling as its cruelty. "And here," he continued, his finger tapping a specific entry on the ledger, the sound sharp in the quiet room, various chemical compounds. Potassium chlorate and sulfur, for instance. When combined and ignited, they produce a rather unsettling greenish flare and a considerable volume of smoke, are mysterious mists, I fancy," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. "Good heavens, Holmes, the sheer, calculated cruelty of it all," commented Dr. John Watson. "Indeed, other entries suggest substances capable of producing peculiar, disquieting odors, further designed to prey upon the nerves," Sherlock Holmes responded. He then picked up a diagram of the old house's original plans, which we had procured with some difficulty earlier in our investigation. The stiff paper rustled as he spread it out across a clear space on the table. It depicted a network of antiquated speaking tubes, a common feature in such grand Victorian residences, though largely fallen into disuse. The disembodied voices, Watson, are no longer a mystery. These tubes, long forgotten by most, connect disparate parts of the house. With a simple mouthpiece, perhaps one crafted to distort the timbre, our villain could whisper his terrors from any number of hidden locations, observed Sherlock Holmes. So that's how he projected those dreadful whispers, directly into her rooms, making her believe she was losing her sanity, Dr. John Watson commented. "Indubitably. The report from our young friend even mentions the purchase of components suitable for crafting just such a distorting device," declared Sherlock Holmes. Holmes rose and paced the length of the small room, the floorboards creaking softly under his tread. He paused by the window, looking out at the dreary London sky. "It is a comprehensive system of deceit, Watson, cleverly integrated. And who would possess the intimate knowledge of this mansion's archaic systems, its forgotten passages and speaking tubes, if not one who has pored over its ancestral records? Mr. Silas Blackwood, with his documented interest in the family estate and its history, as we uncovered, fits the profile perfectly," Sherlock Holmes observed sharply. "Blackwood, it all points to him. His greed for the Periwinkle fortune must be the driving force behind this monstrous deception," responded Dr. John Watson. "Greed, yes, Watson, but perhaps a greed sharpened by a sense of thwarted entitlement. Remember, the Blackwood line once held this estate, and Silas, I suspect, views Mrs. Periwinkle not merely as an obstacle to wealth, but as an usurper of what he believes is his ancestral birthright," explained Sherlock Holmes. "This campaign of terror is not just about acquiring money. It's about reclaiming a perceived legacy, twisted by resentment and a desperate desire to restore his family's faded prominence. His theatrical supplies, combined with his specific architectural knowledge, allowed him to orchestrate this entire charade. He has exploited Mrs. Periwinkle's known vulnerabilities with a chilling lack of conscience, fueled by this potent mix of avarice and wounded pride, deduced Sherlock Holmes. The pieces fell into place with an awful clarity. The vulnerability of Mrs. Periwinkle, the dismissal of her fears, all preyed upon by a calculating mind. The whispers, the moving objects, the spectral lights, all explained by cunning stagecraft. His voice became sharp, decisive. The evidence is now compelling. We have the means, the motive, and thanks to our young friend here, the material proof of the preparations. I believe it is time, Watson, to invite Mr. Blackwood to a private performance, one in which he shall be the principal, albeit unwilling, star. A grim satisfaction settled on Holmes's features. The hunt was nearing its end, and I knew his next move would be to spring the trap he had so meticulously prepared. The air in the room seemed to crackle with anticipation for the confrontation to come. We found ourselves, by Holmes's precise arrangement, within Mrs. Periwinkle's rather somber study. The late afternoon sun cast long, intrusive shadows across the room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. An altogether cheerless scene, I thought. A coal fire muttered quietly in the grate, doing little to dispel the chill I felt, a chill that was more than just the room's temperature. Mr. Silas Blackwood had been summoned and sat opposite Holmes, his posture rigid, a flicker of apprehension in his otherwise defiant eyes that he could not quite conceal, try as he might. The only other sound was the measured tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall, each beat seeming to hammer home the gravity of the impending confrontation. Holmes finally spoke, his voice calm, yet holding an edge as keen as a newly honed razor. "Mr. Blackwood, we have, I believe, reached the denouement of this rather unpleasant theatrical performance," deduced Sherlock Holmes. Blackwood scoffed, a dry, rasping sound that, to my ears, held more bravado than genuine indignation. "Performance, Mr. Holmes. I am quite at a loss to understand your meaning. I came here concerned for my aunt's well-being," Mr. Silas Blackwood answered. "Your concern is touching," Sherlock Holmes said. Holmes countered, his gaze unwavering, though somewhat belatedly, and I fear disingenuously expressed. "Let us dispense with pleasantries," replied Sherlock Holmes. Holmes paused, allowing his words to settle in the heavy air of the study. I saw Blackwood flinch, ever so slightly, though he attempted to maintain his composure. The phosphorus for the spectral glows, the fine wires for the dancing apparitions, the chemicals for the unsettling odors, all purchased under an assumed name, yet traced back to an address with which you are intimately familiar, deduced Sherlock Holmes. He listed each damning piece of evidence with methodical precision, his voice devoid of overt emotion, but heavy with irrefutable accusation. Blackwood's facade was beginning to crack. "Furthermore, your unique ancestral knowledge of this mansion's antiquated speaking tubes and forgotten passages provided the very stage upon which your deceptions were played," Sherlock Holmes pointed out. I watched Blackwood's face. The color drained from it slowly, leaving behind a waxy pallor that spoke volumes of his crumbling composure. His Adam's apple bobbed convulsively, a telltale sign, I've often found, of a man cornered by truth. Blackwood's attempt at indignation was feeble, his voice now lacking its earlier assurance. "This is outrageous, preposterous accusations," Mr. Silas Blackwood replied. "Is it? Consider the incident of the whispering voice that counseled your aunt to abandon this house, specifically mentioning the north wing's instability." Sherlock Holmes responded. He let that particular detail hang in the air. I observed Blackwood shift uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting towards the window as if seeking an escape he knew was not there. "A detail, Mr. Blackwood, that only one with access to the original architect's private journals bequeathed to your branch of the family would appreciate. Journals you consulted, by your own admission to your solicitor a mere 2 months past," Sherlock Holmes said. Holmes leaned forward then, his eyes like chips of ice, the quiet intensity in his tone more effective than any raised voice. The study seemed to grow colder. "The trap, you see, was not in the house, but in your own avarice and specialized knowledge," stated Sherlock Holmes. A heavy silence descended. Blackwood's ragged breathing punctuated the stillness. Before our eyes, he seemed to shrink into his chair, the fight visibly draining from him. Then, like a dam breaking, his composure shattered entirely. His voice was a mere croak, thick with despair. "It was the debts. The creditors were hounding me. I was ruined, utterly ruined. And she sat upon a fortune, frittering it away on whims, whilst I, her own blood, faced disgrace," Mr. Sealers Blackwood said. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The confession, once begun, poured from him in a torrent of self-pity and twisted justification that I found particularly distasteful, for it lacked any genuine remorse for his victim. The old house, I knew its secrets from boyhood tales. The speaking tubes, it was so easy to make her hear things, to make her doubt her own mind, Mr. Sealers Blackwood said. He lifted his head slightly, a flicker of something akin to a perverse pride in his own cunning momentarily surfacing through his wretchedness. It was a chilling glimpse into his distorted reasoning. A little phosphorus here, a wire there, simple theatrical tricks to create an atmosphere of dread. I never meant her true harm, only to persuade her the house was unlivable, that she should sell, and then perhaps assist her less fortunate relations, Mr. Sealers Blackwood answered. As his wretched explanation reached its peak, a faint sound from the doorway, a stifled gasp, drew our attention. My heart sank at the sight. There stood Mrs. Periwinkle, pale as death, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a horror that transcended fear and touched upon the deepest betrayal. She had evidently been standing in the adjoining room, the door left ajar, and had heard every word. A cruel eavesdropping forced upon her by her nephew's own villainy. Holmes's voice softened almost imperceptibly, though a sternness remained. "Indeed, Mr. Blackwood, you have succeeded only in revealing the depths of your own desperation and cruelty," remarked Sherlock Holmes. Blackwood looked up, saw his aunt, and his face crumpled further into a mask of shame, and perhaps a dawning, terrible understanding of the true consequences of his actions. The study felt suddenly colder, the shadows deeper, as the full weight of the nephew's gambit settled upon us all. It was a profoundly grim tableau, leaving a devastated woman to face the ruin of her trust, and I felt a deep pang of sympathy for her plight. The heavy tread of constables faded as they escorted Mr. Sealers Blackwood down the main staircase and out to the Mayfair Street. From Mrs. Periwinkle's private sitting room, we heard the distinct rumble of a police wagon pulling away. The door clicked shut, severing the last tie to the immediate horror of the confrontation. Mrs. Periwinkle sat small and still upon the chaise longue, a delicate teacup trembling in her grasp. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, a calm, reassuring presence, was beside her in the firelit room. Only the gentle hiss and crackle of coals and the hall clock's distant, rhythmic tick marked time now irrevocably altered. Her voice was low and steady, a balm in the charged atmosphere. "It is over, Agnes. The deception has been fully exposed," remarked Dr. Elizabeth Hartley. Mrs. Periwinkle raised her eyes, shadowed with profound weariness, yet a flicker beyond fear was dawning within them. She looked towards Holmes, who stood by the mantelpiece, his expression uncharacteristically softened. He truly did all those things," Mrs. Periwinkle whispered, her voice laced with disbelief. "The voices, the disturbances, it was all him," replied Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle. Holmes pushed himself from the mantelpiece and took a step closer, his usual briskness tempered with a rare gentleness. "Indeed, madam, Mr. Blackwood has confessed to a most elaborate and cruel charade. He exploited his knowledge of this house's older communication systems, disused speaking tubes, cleverly concealed, allowed him to project his voice. Other effects were simple theatrical trickery, designed to prey upon your nerves and convince you of your own instability, deduced Sherlock Holmes. He paused, allowing his words to settle. The only sign of his usual analytical self was the way his fingers steepled briefly before he continued. Your senses did not deceive you, Mrs. Periwinkle. You heard what you heard and saw what was contrived for you to see. The fault lay not with your perception, but with his calculated malice. Sherlock Holmes said. A long, shuddering sigh escaped Mrs. Periwinkle. It was a sound of immense pain, but also, I thought, of a burden beginning to lift. Dr. Hartley placed a comforting hand on her arm. What you have endured, Agnes, is a profound psychological assault. It is natural to feel betrayed, to doubt oneself after such an ordeal. But Mr. Holmes is correct. Your experiences were real, manufactured by another to cause you distress. Your mind was, and is, perfectly sound. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley replied. Mrs. Periwinkle looked from Dr. Hartley to Holmes, then down at her slowly unclasped hands. Dawning comprehension and a gathering resolve began to clear the devastation from her expression. Her voice, when she spoke again, was firmer, though still quiet. He wished me to believe I was mad. To what end? This house, Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle answered. Precisely, madam. To have you committed, or at the very least, to cede control of your affairs and your property to him, under the guise of caring for an unstable relative. Avarice, Mrs. Periwinkle, was his sole motivation, Sherlock Holmes pointed out. A tear traced a path down Mrs. Periwinkle's cheek, but she wiped it away with a new-found determination. She sat a little straighter. He will not succeed. This is my home, and I am not mad. Her declaration, though softly spoken, resonated with an undeniable strength in the quiet room. Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle said. Dr. Hartley smiled, a genuine expression of approval. Holmes gave a curt nod, a sign of his own satisfaction at this display of resilience. Indeed you are not, Mrs. Periwinkle, I found myself saying, my voice perhaps a little warmer than usual. You have shown remarkable fortitude, asked Dr. John Watson. She offered a small, wan smile in return. The path ahead would be challenging, yet the terror that had gripped her was receding, replaced by an awakened spirit ready to reclaim her life. The city's quiet hum outside seemed less menacing, now a backdrop to the justice to follow. The resolution of the Periwinkle affair was, in its way, as quiet as the insidious whispers that had so tormented the poor lady. We stood in the grand, now silent, hallway of the Mayfair mansion. The heavy tread of a police constable echoed on the marble floor as Mr. Silas Blackwood, his face a mask of sullen resentment, was escorted from the premises. The clink of handcuffs was a grim, metallic punctuation to his villainy. Mrs. Periwinkle, pale but composed, watched him depart. There was no triumph in her gaze, only a profound weariness, and perhaps the dawning of a hard-won peace. Young Martha Scrubbs stood respectfully beside her, a steadfast presence. As the front door closed with a solid thud, sealing Blackwood's fate, Mrs. Periwinkle turned to the girl. Mrs. Periwinkle addressed her, her voice low but surprisingly firm. Martha, my dear, I owe you more than I can say. You believed me when no one else would, responded Mrs. Agnes Periwinkle. Martha responded, offering a small, reassuring smile. It was nothing, ma'am. Anyone could see you were suffering. It's a shame others were so quick to dismiss a lady's fears, responded Martha Scrubbs. Holmes, who had been observing the exchange with his customary intensity, made a slight, almost imperceptible movement. It was Martha's simple, unvarnished statement that seemed to catch his attention. He turned to me as Mrs. Periwinkle drew Martha into a quiet conversation, his brow furrowed. Holmes commented, his voice unusually subdued and lacking its customary sharp edge. Quick to dismiss, Watson. Indeed, the most dangerous assumptions are often those we make about the perceived vulnerabilities of others, observed Sherlock Holmes. I agreed, nodding slowly. A sobering observation, Holmes, particularly after witnessing Mrs. Periwinkle's ordeal and hearing young Martha's plain words, commented Dr. John Watson. His introspective tone, so rarely heard, resonated deeply. We took our leave shortly thereafter. The sounds of London, the distant clatter of hooves on cobblestones and the cries of street vendors, gradually enveloped us as our hansom cab rattled towards Baker Street. The fog was beginning to creep in, muffling the city's clamor, and the gas lamps cast hazy aureoles in the gloom. Later that evening, a chill rain pattered against the window panes of our rooms at 221B. Holmes broke the long silence, his gaze fixed on the flickering fire. Pipe smoke coiled upwards in the still air as he spoke. It is a peculiar facet of human nature, Watson, Holmes mused, his voice tinged with regret, to undervalue the testimony of those deemed overwrought. Mrs. Periwinkle's distress was palpable, yet it was initially ascribed to feminine hysteria rather than calculated cruelty. I fear I, too, was not immune to such hasty judgments, replied Sherlock Holmes. He rose and began to pace, the floorboards creaking softly beneath his feet, a familiar rhythm in our shared quarters. I confess, Watson, Holmes elaborated, his voice tinged with a rare self-reproach, that even I harbored a degree of initial skepticism regarding Mrs. Periwinkle's claims. My own approach is to seek the rational, the tangible, and I perhaps underestimated the profound psychological torment inflicted. Yet, the purely psychological wound, inflicted with such cynical precision as Blackwood employed, can be as devastating as any physical blow. The true evidence here was not merely the speaking tubes and the theatrical contrivances, but the systematic erosion of a woman's confidence in her own senses, replied Sherlock Holmes. You saw through it, Holmes, as always, I ventured, attempting to lighten his mood, responded Dr. John Watson. He stopped his pacing and looked at me, a thoughtful expression in his keen eyes. Perhaps, Watson, Holmes acknowledged, his tone measured. But this case has served as a potent reminder. The whispers within those walls were a crude amplification of a societal tendency to silence or ignore. It is fortunate that young Martha, through her own channels, possessed the clarity and courage to seek an alternative ear. Such networks, born of necessity, often prove surprisingly effective, declared Sherlock Holmes. His final words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I sensed that this case, more than many others, had left a profound mark upon my friend, stirring reflections that went far beyond the mere solution of a crime. And in his mention of Martha's channels, I could already foresee the quiet, determined efforts that would follow beyond the purview of Scotland Yard to ensure such cruel deceptions found fewer victims. The immediate aftermath of the Periwinkle affair brought with it a profound sense of justice. Yet, it was not in quiet contemplation that its lessons were to be absorbed by all. Indeed, Holmes himself had shown a rare introspection, a softening of his usual clinical detachment, when considering the torments Mrs. Periwinkle had endured. But it was from young Martha Scrubbs that I learned of the swift, practical measures taken by her remarkable associates, her spirit visibly fortified by the ordeal and the genuine gratitude of her mistress. She recounted to me, with a clarity that bespoke her growing stature within their ranks, the details of a meeting convened with purposeful haste. Their gathering was not in some grand hall. As Martha described it, it was a modest, clean-swept room above a cooperating tradesman's premises, the usual city hum muted by drawn curtains. The air within, Martha conveyed, was thick with a quiet satisfaction, a shared sense of a difficult task well accomplished. Though not given to boisterous displays, the relief and pride in their collective success were palpable, the gentle clinking of teacups perhaps a little more cheerful than usual. Indeed, one woman, a laundress whose hands spoke of honest toil, raised her cup with a smile. To Mrs. Periwinkle's peace at last, and to young Martha for her courage, remarked sisterhood member, laundress. A warm murmur of aye to Martha, and justice served, rippled through the room. Martha felt a blush rise to her cheeks, but also a profound sense of belonging and shared achievement. A senior member, a woman whose name Martha did not divulge, but whose presence clearly commanded respect, allowed a moment for this heartfelt acknowledgment to settle before she opened their discussion. Her voice, Martha recalled, was calm but carried an undeniable weight of authority, guiding them back to their purposeful resolve. The Periwinkle matter is concluded, and justice, in its fashion, will be served. Our purpose now is to draw strength and strategy from it. We have seen how easily a vulnerable woman can be isolated and preyed upon by insidious means, answered senior sisterhood member. A murmur of assent went around the small circle. Then Martha, emboldened, offered her own observations, her voice clear and steady, a contrast to the timidity she had first shown at Baker Street. Indeed, the very nature of the trickery made Mrs. Periwinkle doubt herself. Speaking tubes, manipulated gaslights, things hidden in walls. If we know these methods, they lose power. And we who work in these great houses, we see and hear much, remarked Martha Scrubbs. Her point was clearly well received. The senior member nodded, a flicker of approval in her keen eyes. Precisely, Martha. Knowledge is our first line of defense. We must establish a means, discreet yet effective, to share warnings. A network. When one of us observes suspicious patterns or learns of a household where a lady seems unduly distressed by inexplicable events, word must pass, replied senior sisterhood member. Another woman, older with hands calloused from honest work, spoke then, her tone practical. Through service then. A quiet word from a laundress to a cook, from a housemaid to a lady's maid in another establishment. We build a web of whispers, but ours will be whispers of caution, not of fear, remarked older sisterhood member. Martha related how the discussion swiftly addressed psychological manipulation. They spoke of isolation, dismissal of concerns, and erosion of confidence, responded Martha Scrubbs. The group resolved to warn potential victims and offer support. We must validate their experiences, sisterhood member said, and we must be quicker to identify when a mistress's nerves are not mere fancy, but the product of deliberate cruelty. Too often, such complaints are dismissed, even by doctors, answered Martha Scrubbs. Martha herself, I gathered, was tasked with a significant responsibility. She would help coordinate this nascent warning system amongst the domestic staff in several Mayfair residences, a role she accepted with quiet determination. There was a palpable sense of purpose in that little room. A potent force for good was being forged in the shadows, far from the public eye. Their true victory was not in the downfall of Blackwood alone. It lay in this immediate translation of hard-won experience into protective action. It struck me then how these unassuming women, through their solidarity and sharp understanding of the world they inhabited, were building a defense far more practical, perhaps, than any single detective could devise. Their quiet work, I suspected, was but one current in a rising tide of change. It was a sentiment, I felt, that would soon find more vocal expression in other, more public forums. The drawing room of Mrs. Hudson's establishment, usually a haven of quiet domesticity, was tonight transformed. A vibrant energy filled the air, a chorus of earnest voices rising and falling in spirited debate. The scent of Earl Grey and beeswax mingled with the faint, invigorating aroma of damp wool from coats recently shed, for a light drizzle had begun to slick the London streets outside. Holmes and I had arrived to find the suffragist salon in full session, the Periwinkle case clearly the topic, inflaming such passionate discourse. Her voice, warm yet carrying an undeniable authority, cut gently through the polite clamor. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, do come in. Dr. Hartley was just sharing some most pertinent observations," Mrs. Hudson replied. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, a woman of keen intellect and composed demeanor, stood near the mantelpiece. Her clear, resonant tones commanded attention. "The true cruelty of Mr. Blackwood's machinations," she was saying, her gaze sweeping the assembled ladies, lay not merely in avarice, but in the deliberate erosion of Mrs. Periwinkle's sanity. For too long, society, and many in my profession, have been swift to dismiss a woman's distress as hysteria, a flight of fancy. This affair demonstrates, quite chillingly, how such prejudices can be weaponized. Dr. Elizabeth Hartley said. A murmur of agreement, punctuated by the clinking of teacups, rippled through the room. I noted young Martha Scrubbs amongst them, her expression one of quiet pride, a testament to her own vital role. The debate that followed was indeed lively, touching upon the legal standing of psychological torment and the urgent need for women's testimony to be afforded greater weight. Then all eyes turned, as Mrs. Hudson gestured towards my companion. "Mr. Holmes," Mrs. Hudson's voice carried across the room, "perhaps you would care to offer your unique perspective on these matters," responded Mrs. Hudson. A hush fell over the salon. Holmes, who had been observing the proceedings with his customary intensity, stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice carried a thoughtful gravity, devoid of its frequent sardonic edge. The case of the Whispering Walls presented singular features. Silas Blackwood's methods were designed to prey upon the mind, creating terror through intangible means. Traditional evidence was scarce, Sherlock Holmes said. He paused, his eyes briefly finding Martha in the crowd. A flicker of something akin to approval crossed his face. It became evident the solution lay not in examining physical traces alone, but in understanding the subtle currents of the household, its unseen dynamics. Here, the contributions of the Baker Street Irregulars Sisterhood were indispensable. "Miss Scrubbs, your astute observations provided the bedrock upon which the truth was built," stated Sherlock Holmes. A soft gasp went around the room, followed by a ripple of applause that grew in strength. Martha herself blushed deeply, but met Holmes's gaze with newfound composure. "This case," he continued, his voice regaining some of its familiar sharpness, though directed now at a broader principle, "has underscored a truth I have been slow to fully appreciate. There exist networks of information and perception, particularly amongst women, frequently discounted by official inquiry. The domestic sphere, so often dismissed, can be a theater of profound observation. To ignore such perspectives is a professional failing." The silence that followed this pronouncement was profound, more impactful than any applause. Then conversation erupted, not in disagreement, but in a wave of energized discussion, of questions, of affirmations. Holmes had not merely solved a case. He had, it seemed, publicly validated an entire sphere of experience. He added, almost as an afterthought, yet with a distinct note of sincerity, "It has been an education, ladies. A most instructive one," observed Sherlock Holmes, as we later descended the steps of Mrs. Hudson's home into the damp London night. The sound of the salon's continuing, animated discussion followed us. The echoes of change, I reflected, were often quiet at first, but tonight they had resonated with undeniable force. Holmes, for his part, was uncharacteristically silent, lost in thought, the gaslight glinting on his hawk-like features. The city, and perhaps even its greatest detective, would not be quite the same.